Pastoral considerations to accomplish, perhaps an historical first, a common Easter as a pastorally worthwhile innovation in Christianity. The fools would rather disagree with the Son than agree with the Pope. This clever saying, often in literature attributed to Voltaire, is one whereby Voltaire himself allegedly cited Johannes Kepler about the Protestant refusal to accept the Gregorian reform. It could be lobbed at both some Eastern Catholic and many Eastern Orthodox churches nowadays, without need to adjust the citation since anti-papal circumstances and internal disputes among the communities affected saw the calendar as a threat of concession to a pope, as that which justifies ignoring the sun, just as England had done from 1585 until its final and successful push to accept the sun and the moon universally, following Elizabeth I's and others' failures to win the papal calendar its proper astronomical place under the sun in 1752. Popery, or the anti-Roman reflex, as it has been named in more recent times, can be accurately diagnosed as a radix malorum. Sometimes this is directly the case, sometimes by proxy, as popery is attributed to the allegedly would-be Pope of New Rome. It can be argued without much effort to be a principal focus in Eastern Catholic and Orthodox calendrical debates today. Even so, a common Easter date, i.e. a common calendar, proves to be a romantic idea that has distracted the attention of churchmen for centuries, on record beginning with the Quartodeciman controversy as explained by Reverend Dr. Baer in his talk. Allegedly, universally common Easter celebrations existed somewhere at some time, albeit historical fiction and wishful thinking projected onto the past for whatever the contemporary needs of an individual or a community nowadays might be. It is not inappropriate, in my view, to search a common Easter due to the demands of pastoral theology, since Christian clergy, who typically decide on such matters, pastor real people who encounter real problems by a divided Easter. While I do not believe evidence supports any period of the Church having a universally adopted calendar whereby Easter fell on the same solar day or lunar eve among all Christian churches of Christendom, that does not mean that technology and the science of astronomy ought to be pastorally ignored in favor of historical failure of Christian churches of the first millennium to centralize their Easter calendar. Yet comically, I must admit that we do not even have the luxury of a Christian, let alone specifically Byzantine meaning of Pascha throughout history in order to signify and justify a common resurrection feast, but rather different meanings at various times and places for what Pascha means. Passover and death were the main themes in Pascha calendars of the oldest Orthodox, viz. Anti-Arian Christians, to say nothing of post-Chalcedonian churches. If Pascha originally meant something like death and crucifixion, but it means today mainly resurrection, what continuity does our calendar really have with the past? I hope to give some historical data next to justify the seriousness of this question before addressing only pastoral reasons, not historical or theological justifications for a common Easter celebration. This next section I entitle From Jesus' Martyrial Feast to Movable Crucifixion Pascha. As I represent an academic institution whose ritual churches celebrate the Byzantine Rite, of whom some use the Julian calendar, let me begin with St. John Chrysostom. The Roman designation of 25 March, AD 29 for Pascha, as anniversary of Jesus' historical passion and conception, best accounts for what we know of the meaning of the word Pascha, or Easter, in 4th century Constantinople. The evidence in both Antioch and Constantinople during the life of Chrysostom shows that Pascha signified really and principally the passion of Good Friday, just like in Rome. Even so, by the time of John Malolus, which is of course centuries later, Constantinopolitans had transferred the signification of the term Pascha to refer to the Sunday of Resurrection. Regarding the history of both the date and the meaning of Pascha, I bypass unrelated problems surrounding quartodecimans, ably treated, no doubt, by Reverend Dr. Baer, for whom the day of the week and the date of March the 25th was not central, but only the actual reckoning of the 14th of the month of Nisan. What was becoming central for non-quartodeciman Christians, we'll call them regular Christians, at large by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, is that the liturgical year took its point of departure from a devised movable Pascha, a movable Pascha date above and beyond the old fixed anniversary of Jesus' March 25th death. Eventually in Constantinople, Pascha took on biblical significance, as in Yahweh's command to the Israelites, quote, "The Lord said to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, 'This month of Passover will mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be for you the first month of the year.'" End quote. Exodus 12:1. Some ancient rabbinic commentary not only considered the month Nisan as the first religious versus civil month of the year, but also the very month of the creation of the world. This worked well with the Roman pagan calendar, too, which anciently counted March, for various and sundry reasons, as the first month of the year. It was difficult for literary Romans of the empire, that is, practically all literati after AD 212, to forget legends that March marked Romulus's new year and religious rites of so-called new beginnings. There was a fascination with March, since it actually counted as the first month of the year preceding April, May, June, and then the numerical months, Quintilis, now July, Sextilis, now August, and September, November, December. In parallel, both the Jewish and, in a mythical way, the Roman calendrical notions surrounding the month of March favored the beginning of the earliest identifiable cycle of liturgical readings, for example, in Byzantium, during the reign of Justinian at Pascha. The historically extant sources lend themselves to the inference that Alexandria, Rome, and a number of Asian dioceses reckon non-quartodeciman Pascha, normal Christian Pascha, as we called it, according to the Alexandrian Computus in the 2nd century. Later, attested witnesses within the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire developed the festival of Pascha in remote relation to Tertullian, through the more proximate source of Julius Africanus, cited by Eusebius, whose calculations factored into the question of dating Pascha, i.e., his Passion-Resurrection feast rolled into a one-day celebration. Well, what would Pascha have meant in 5th century Constantinople of Chrysostom? First, Tertullian promoted a Western Roman tradition dating Jesus' Passion to Friday, March the 25th, in the consulship of the two Gemini of AD 29. Tertullian had some influence on important Greek texts like those of Eusebius the historian. But in Alexandria, the first Greek text on the question by Clement of Alexandria interprets pathos, suffering, despite problems determining what year Clement might have chosen for Christ's crucifixion, pathos of Christ to occur on some or another Friday versus Sunday on March the 25th. Later, Julius Africanus, around 240 AD, may have either dated Jesus' Passion to AD 30 or more likely to AD 31. If the latter, then he dated the Passion to Friday, March the 25th, more accessible to Constantinopolitan Greeks. However, was Hippolytus, who had dated the Passion to Friday, March 25th, AD 29. Next among Greek writers, in the testimony of the 9th century chronicler George Synkelus, who invoked one Annianus of Alexandria, whose date of death we'll put at 412, as reported to teach the conception of Jesus occurring on March the 25th in the year after creation 5501, while the Paschal resurrection occurred on March 25th in the year after creation 5534. The emerging patterns that we see by referring to all these data only bring about a couple of quasi-constants in the known Greek East, namely, whatever aspect of the Triduum that Pascha signifies, it refers to March the 25th, and secondly, that March the 25th derives its significance typologically from one of the days of creation and or the day of conception of Jesus. Just about everything else is variable. Unfortunately, no known calendrical system was definitively worked out for Constantinople in the mid to late 5th century. Instead, we must jump forward to the 7th century Chronicon Paschale that opted for AD 31 as the year for Christ's death, while Jesus' resurrection Pascha, meaning the theme of Pascha turning to the resurrection, is stated to have occurred on Sunday, March the 25th, which is probably in deliberate conformity with Julius Africanus. As we can see, there is no universal custom of Pascha attested in the early sources, though the question is considered significant and important for Christians to know in order to celebrate the Paschal mystery. Sometime prior to Malleus, there was a Constantinopolitan shift in focus to the Easter Sunday as exclusively the day of Pascha, not the sacrifice on Good Friday. This might be accounted for by the development of the movable liturgical cycle, first abandoning the fixed date of March the 25th with its combined Passion-Resurrection anniversary. The Sunday of Resurrection eventually expanded to include a 6-day fast, to which a full-fledged Lenten cycle was added in the 4th and 5th century Constantinople. Taking all the evidence together, I surmise that a separation of the Passion from the Resurrection occurred after the formally all-inclusive March the 25th Pascha martyrial date became identified principally instead in theme with a movable Sunday known as Easter Sunday. Then, resurrection was gradually historicized to cover a 3-day pre-baptismal fast so that Thursday night and Friday were identified with the sacrifice of Pascha, and Sunday with the resurrection, called Pascha, in both Antioch and Constantinople. However, when the movable cycle based on resurrection developed a complete cycle of readings, the term Pascha, like Exodus 12:1, began to designate the beginning of the liturgical year from the Sunday of resurrection. The eve of the Passion of Holy Thursday, which is liturgically Good Friday, marked an historicization of the events of Jesus' suffering over 3 days of the Triduum starting in the 5th century. The capital, Constantinople, by now would have had a somewhat weakened observance of March the 25th as the martyrial day signifying creation, conception, and Christ's passion and resurrection together. After all, the movable cycle had long been embracing the Passion and Resurrection as its principal liturgical days. Still, no extant sources can help identify when Constantinople would have definitely adopted Pascha under the moniker of Resurrection and relegated Passion to Thursday and Friday prior to movable Easter. Yet once this was accomplished, it might explain how the Annunciation first took place on March the 25th, since the Passion and Resurrection of the movable cycle were parasitic on the historical anniversary of Jesus' death and resurrection rolled into the one-day commemoration of March the 25th. For its part, the movable Passion Resurrection Sunday, that is, Easter Sunday, eventually parsed out Holy Thursday and Good Friday. Thus, when Chrysostomon Constantinople celebrated the Passion, that is, Thursday Vigil, and Friday within the movable cycle, Passion, Pascha, and Resurrection had been, by now, so separated that the Passion of Thursday and Friday were completely historicized to anticipate movable Easter Sunday. On the relatively infrequent occasions when movable Passion of Thursday and Friday coincided with the fixed day of creation or conception or Passion, that is, March the 25th, the memory of their thematic unity did not impede a celebration of the conception of Jesus, since all aforementioned themes were typologically linked in popular and learned consciousness. Accordingly, Chrysostom used the terminus technicus Pascha, as typical in the Latin West, to designate Good Friday in the 5th century. Now, both the movable and the immovable dates were effectively celebrate one or the other traditional aspect of primitive Pascha on March the 25th. Subsequently, the newer movable Easter, especially after Nicaea I commended the movable calendar of Rome, as it has been taken and interpreted, became ever more disassociated from the formally all-inclusive Pascha on March the 25th. Gratian, Valentinian II, and Theodosius II, in what was probably a rescript dating to AD 413, had declared years earlier for celebration of a common West-East Easter in both Old Rome and New Rome. Why make such a legislation? Clearly the answer is that the problem came to them of disparate celebrations of Easter upon which different calendars and observatories did not please Imperial Rome's desire for imperial-wide standards. Just as with the spread of the civil calendar to the east based upon the consulships or the offices of Roman officials, so too Pascha now marked a date of civil significance moving from the east to the west of the empire. This problem continued. It did not disappear. Later, in AD 438, Theodosius II promulgated universal legislation, i.e. the Theodosian Code, from the capital for the east and the west, according to the Roman consular calendar. Interestingly, in a number of documents from the Council of Chalcedon, in a subsequent document from the Council of Chalcedon, likely betraying Constantinopolitan conventions, an anonymous writer dates first from Alexander the Great, then takes the date from the Roman calendar, and finally from the calendar of Antioch. Cognizance of and reference to the Roman consular year, coupled with paschal legislation promulgated alike for Constantinople and Rome, retained its force in the East until the publication of Justinian's Code. This suggests regular reliance on the Roman calendar for dating at Constantinople until consular dating was completely replaced by reference to the year of indiction, which is, of course, a tax farming convention. However, this did not mean that Alexandria ceased to have differing dates and its own adherents to the extent that the imperial law did not receive its force, since we get no sense of imperial crackdown to finally get local communities to abandon their putatively apostolic rites and customs about Easter dates, and to follow instead the civilly privileged computations of Old Rome. Nonetheless, leading up to the adoption of Roman Easter at Constantinople at this time, ecclesiastical figures such as the Alexandrian Athanasius may have inspired such a preference, since Athanasius dated according to Roman consuls, while simultaneously increasing his own efforts in Alexandria to conform more greatly to the Easter computation in line with the Bishop of Rome, even to the point of adjusting Alexandrian Easter to better accommodate Rome's demands that Pascha always postdate March the 25th. In fact, subsequent records show some Greek-speaking Christians of the late 4th century, who were anti-Arian, were abandoning the Alexandrian calendar to follow the Roman calendrical system, since the Alexandrian computation began to be associated popularly with Arianism in select quarters of the Greek East and Latin West. Finally, John Chrysostom at Antioch in AD 387 deserves mention. He opposed publicly an Alexandrian calendrical principle for Easter calculation, establishing dates for Pascha in violation of Nicaea's anti-Jewish legislation regarding the vernal equinox. Subsequently, Chrysostom transferred to Constantinople and came into conflict with Theophilus of Alexandria, while receiving support from the liturgically conscientious Pope Innocent of Rome. Altogether, this suggests that Chrysostom would have been aware of and sympathetic to Roman Easter computation over its Alexandrian rival. Even in later centuries, when more standardization might have been expected in the capital, we instead find John Malolus wrestling for the supremacy of one Eastern Roman tradition over another, as, for example, dating the creation of the world to approximately 5500 BC. My next section is blind, old calendarists, instead of any other way of expressing it might be blind, old calendarists. I just had my first eye exam in 7 years, so that I felt like I could interrogate my optometrist and learn lots of new things about the about the state of the art in 2022. Among many questions, I received an answer to one of them that was surprising and somewhat disappointing. It is universally the case that our eyes degenerate over time, and it is merely the question of our individual devolution relative to others. Prior to 1721, and Galileo's somewhat dubious but nonetheless patented claim to have invented the first telescope, old rabbis and seasoned astronomers were the gatekeepers for judging astronomical occurrences, like new moons, by their own eyesight. Inevitably, the more skillful and a rabbi or expert got at citing moons, the more aged he got, and presumably the worse his eyesight. Scholars note already that this is just one of a host of oft-ignored real factors in the calendrical problems. In fact, Dead Sea scholars like to point out even more comical problems in astronomy that distinguish calendrical sects. The Essenes, for example, felt justified imputing heterodoxy to the Pharisees' rabbis, who had the special gift of citing new moons to establish that a Sabbath, along with a Sabbath observance festival day, should not fall next to each other on the month to make sure that there was a day in between the two festival days in order to allow for cooking before both feasts. Likewise, as Moshammer's magisterial work underlines, problems occur in being too strict with ancient calendrical measurement when we don't account for the fact that we have evidence in Jewish and other literature about arguments reduced to things like the subjective eyeball and what Bob may see with his eyes versus Frank sees with his eyes when, allegedly, a new moon has been sighted. Calendars are records of astronomical phenomena, and in the ancient world, astronomical phenomena from my point of view in both space and time, as well as even my eyesight, which for Christians is measured in the context of the Old Testament Pascha with some adjusted rules. We should expect that without anything from a standard eye exam to a standard set of instruments, unlike today, a universal Pascha could have only been imposed by a draconian emperor using violence and many resources to center calculations on one observatory within the imperium, but it would have required exhausting the empire's resources to accomplish this, as even Elizabeth I found out was the case, making her unable to accomplish the task of making her calendar agree with the sun in England. However, it appears that this never really happened, even if the emperor legislated as if it would happen in the imperium. Perhaps the first hopeful reason in history to date a common calendar in Christendom for Easter is that we can now all agree upon the same astronomical instruments as capable of providing a standard by which to judge the sun and the moon in reference to the earth with pinpoint accuracy. But then again, in some places it has now become fashionable to say that pagan Julian calendar is not about time, astronomy, or meteorological phenomenon, but its significance is so much more. At least it has become such to meet contemporary wants and needs for some groups of today's Eastern Christians. Unfortunately, these wants are most often associated with apologetics against the other, who are obviously using a different and undoubtedly wrong calendar when identifying themselves as a homogeneous group of privileged believers. To place Julius Caesar's history of the movements of the sun and the moon as a standard of orthodoxy finds no sympathy in this talk. And I leave it to centaur hunters and goat stag herdsmen to invent ever-increasing rationales to favor uncalendrical calendars that no longer measure real time according to any historically or scientifically known register, where Christianity sprung up and flourished. The data in Byzantium and in the Roman Empire were used for timekeeping. This is what Christianity inherited. In later Byzantium, scholars who were favored at the time by the Palamites of the Byzantine court, Barlaam the Calabrian, and especially Nicephorus Gregoras, before their ill repute came upon them, were supported in figuring out necessary solutions to this time-centered problem. For example, Gregoras's solution, in summary, substantially anticipated the Gregorian calendar, addressing real challenges like predictable times to plant crops. Imagine using ancient data and sources of information to believe that the 11th of March is the day on which one should plant versus the 25th of March due to problems with the calendar, which would have been the case at least in the 16th century. Or another problem, the indictus times of taxation, where presumably the harvest should be ready by now. and thus people should be able to pay their taxes, though placing the tax time before the harvest is actually done makes it difficult to tax fruits that are not yet ripe and certainly not harvested. Until the fall of Byzantium, the question of the calendar was a question of getting the sun and the moon right, since life and death resulted in a world largely unacquainted with food supply, food surpluses. When this life-death question on the calendar was, by and large, osios, in the West, by the mid-20th century, the question was less effortlessly able to devolve into fantasies of orthodoxy versus heterodoxy, of secularity versus religiosity, even should it find no merit in the lived experience within the historical records of Byzantium, but follow rather the outlines of some sort of Nachleben of the lack of calendrical reforms receptivity by Protestant Europe against astronomical Jesuits, and popes, who were apparently expanding, in a very different way, their temporal powers in a divided Christendom. My conclusions. The impetus for a reform and a common Easter. It seems to me that, similar to the 18th century, that we cannot know what fortunes in the Eastern churches might lead to seeing the sun and the moon, not Pope Gregory the 13th, and his church as the central focus of the question of Easter. For its part, with the papacy having tacitly reconciled itself to Galileo's worldview, as when Leo XIII symbolically erected an observatory in the 19th century, though without any mention of Galilei, the status questionis in the Vatican is likely to grant just about any and every concession to Eastern Christian sensitivities for the sake of unity, provided that the papacy is not asked, once again, to pit itself against the sun. It perhaps is still subject to criticism by its own underreporting of itself regarding its past corporate responsibility for its failures in this regard, though John Paul II clearly moved the needle in the right direction during his pontificate. So, given the fact that the papacy, since Vatican II, is consistently enjoying a most open-minded and a meritoriously concessive attitude towards Eastern concerns and values, every reason beckons the possibility of arriving at a united Pascha, provided that, with respect to Brother Guy Consolomagno of the Vatican Observatory, and not to mention the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, we see that the sun and the moon can be given their rightful place in the course of such an agreement. Why should a common Easter exist, though, if there is nothing in actual history and Orthodox theology to demand it? The reasons are manifold. As my own priest colleague had to cancel his retreat and refused to see a spiritual director at his own Eastern monastery that he calls home, after he realized that the Pascha he had just celebrated in his parish would result in doing a Lenten retreat with his spiritual father, who was in the doldrums of Lent in his old calendarist monastery, and it would require him, his spiritual father, to fast, and that there was no joy of the resurrection there to be found. The divided families across jurisdictions, even within the same church, who fight about fasts and church attendance based upon not the sun, but sometimes about who is right and wrong, oftentimes in reaction to an alleged New World Order or conspiracies or other things that we find as pastors are often the concerns of those who are in the pews. The reason why we can hope or perhaps work towards a united Easter are other reasons. A priest friend of mine, whose Ruthenian parish uses the Gregorian calendar, while his second parish, a Russian parish, uses the revised Julian calendar. But they have been making a determined effort to go back to the unadulterated Julian calendar as some sort of spiritual quest. How is he supposed to live a spiritual life, preach, and benefit from a schizophrenic liturgical life, such as this? It is beyond any of his friends and counselors to advise him. As with Vatican II, calendar reform, and the Conian forms in Russia, churchmen ought to anticipate wailing and gnashing of teeth in the pews or benches or whatever they're sitting or not sitting at, provided that both sufficient and internal peace and unity reign in both the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches when they undertake such an actual reform, brother sun and sister moon are likely the only values that seem to be nowadays non-negotiables on the part of the Vatican when it comes to the real possibility of a solution to these truly distressing difficulties. Stressors that cause spiritual damage in the pews amongst the faithful, and even by those who have care of different parishes. These are the damaging results of the lack of a united Easter for Christendom, especially a more ecumenical Christendom in which families oftentimes intermarry, especially among Eastern Christians and who are both Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic, or non-Chalcedonians, just to name a few possible examples. In the end, these spiritual damaging results of a divided Easter do at least provoke us, I think, pastorally, to attempt to find a way to merge these competing calendars in both the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox communion of churches for the sake of the souls that they will manage to save. Thank you.